Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armouries Bench. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Fighting on Film. We're very lucky this week to be joined by Jonathan Ferguson, who is Keeper of Firearms and Artillery at the Royal Armouries. And we are going to be looking at the most recent adaptation of Last of the Mohicans. Jonathan, thanks for coming on. The first thing we always ask guests is, when did you first see the film?
I wasn't really allowed to go to the cinema that often, and I was just a little bit too early for me to be able to go with my friends and stuff, I guess. Couldn't drive age 13, so I'm pretty sure it would have been one of many films that I saw on TV, probably the network premiere with my parents. So not very exciting, but that would have been it.
Well, I was thinking about it the other day, and I can't remember the first time I saw it. I'm almost certain I got it out of the library.
Wow.
At some point when I was around 10.
That dates you really badly.
Yeah, it does. So it definitely came out of the library, and I was like, oh, that's cool. It's got a gun on the front of it. You just know where it's come from, don't you? Just many trips to the library.
Yeah.
And and then I think I had the VHS of it, and then the DVD. It just really captured my imagination as a kid. I thought, this is amazing. But can you remember when you first saw it, Rob?
Well, I'm the spanner in the works. I'd never seen it until Matt mentioned that we were having
Good question.
Jonathan on, and he was like, "Have you seen Last of the Mohicans?" And I sort of was like, "What? What?" Yes, I'm a big fan of Michael Mann's other work. Like, Heat is like one of my favorite heist movies. I mean, it's incredible. So to see him do a period piece a few years beforehand, it was incredible, and I was not disappointed.
Wes Studi in both of them, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Being a badass.
Which is a great segue into talking about cast, I guess. So we've got Daniel Day-Lewis, who is Nathaniel Hawkeye Poe, and then he's in Fenimore Cooper's book. He's Natty Bumpo.
Yeah.
And hilariously, he's credited on Google as Natty Bumpo. Which is not correct, but hilarious.
The adaptation is based on the novel Last of the Mohicans, which came out in the 1830s, and there's been, I think, about a dozen adaptations for screen, going all the way back to like a silent version in 1909.
Oh wow!
And Mann's 92 version is the most recent, although I think there might have been like a Canadian drama series called Hawkeye that might have been made at some point in the 90s. But anyway, back to the cast.
I mean, Daniel Day-Lewis is huge, isn't he? You know, he's in Lincoln, Gangs of New York. I mean, this is the first movie I'd ever seen him in. Like, I must admit, never seen a Daniel Day-Lewis movie.
My God, that is a hell of a thing to admit on a film podcast.
I know. But you got to, haven't you? You know, we're all, you know.
Anything for honesty, but damn.
One of those actors that passed me by, I'm afraid. So then we've got Major Duncan Hayward, played by Steve Waddington. He was in The Parole Officer with Steve Coogan, one of me and Matt's favourites. And he was also in Face, a 1995 film where he starred alongside Damon Albarn, and that's another heist film.
He's been in loads of stuff. He's a decent actor. You got Madeleine Stowe as Cora Monroe.
She played Julia Moore in We Were Soldiers.
Nice little war movie link. Wes Studi, as John mentioned. Maurice Robes as Colonel Monroe. Pete Postlethwaite's in there as Captain Beams. He has like a very short piece. There's a lot of actors that are in this.
But he's absolutely metal when he's on screen, isn't he?
Yeah, it's a shame his flintlock doesn't work at the end and he just gets clobbered.
He does.
Occupational hazard, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. Colm Meaney, the Irish actor's in there, but I think most of his scenes got cut completely. And there's a very early appearance for Jared Harris.
I thought I heard his voice at one point.
Yes, yeah. So he's the lieutenant at the colonial settlement, the Cameron's homestead, and he's calling on everyone to join the colonial militia.
Oh, that's him.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought I recognised. Yeah.
Yeah, I recognised the voice, but I'd never sort of put two and two together that he was in it.
I thought I was hearing things. I heard his voice and my brain went, Jared Harris. And when I looked back at the screen, no.
Who have I missed? We missed Russell Means,
Oh, yes.
who plays the last of the Mohicans, literally.
Yeah.
Chingachgook.
Oh, and Jodie May as Alice Munro, the Kennel's younger daughter. There's plenty of other people in there, but you basically either they had scenes cut from the film or they didn't quite.
Yeah.
There's one or two other names that you go, they were in that, and you just don't click that they're in there.
I scoured it looking for Cole Meany because you couldn't have disguised Cole Meany. He's that bigger than life sort of that character actor. And I was like, where is he? He's not in this. I was kind of looking forward to him, sending a load of redcoats to their death, but it didn't happen. I was looking forward to that.
I heard of him being in it, and I've seen it at least a dozen times.
It's weird. It's so weird. So production, I guess, we come on to next. So it's directed by Michael Mann, famous for Heat, 1995.
Yeah, 3 years before Heat.
Yeah, 3 years before. And he'd just come off a film called Manhunter in 1986, and that was a little bit of a bomb. So he took some time off, and he came back strong with this one. It was released in the US on the 25th of September, 92. It waited a few months over here. We got it on the 6th of November. It was made for a budget of 40 million. And it made 143 million, so it was a big success, really big film at the time. It didn't come out in the summer, but it really feels like a summer blockbuster, summer epic. And I have a retro review this week, first one we've had for a while. And this comes from the Daily Mirror's film reviewer, Pauline McLeod, from the 6th of November, 96, the day it came out here. War is raging between England and France in the New World. Hawkeye, the adopted son of the last of the Mohicans, falls in love with feisty, headstrong Cora, the daughter of a British officer. After rescuing her and her younger sister from the vicious Huron war captain, Magawa, but the psychotic Magawa is hell-bent on revenge for his people and he watches them being eliminated. He wants the girls and their bombastic father, Colonel Monroe, dead. And this is where the censors have taken a very liberal view of this truly breathtaking historical epic. Okay, there's no sex and there's certainly no bad language, but the fight scenes are so graphic, with the stomach-churning scalpings, tomahawks being thrashed around like meat cleavers, and bodies being hacked to bits. I'm amazed it's been given a 12 certificate. The story is cliched and somewhat predictable, but it's a fascinating insight into American history. And of course, the gorgeous Daniel Day-Lewis is ever present.
Quite the review, the gorgeous Daniel Day-Lewis. He is gorgeous in this. He's got lovely hair.
He does.
But yeah, that's interesting. I don't know whether I would call Monroe's character bombastic, but I suppose the film has that sort of standard trope where the British are the baddies even when they're the goodies in this period. I suppose you come off as rather arrogant. That's kind of a holdover from a lot of the portrayals of this period. So there's a lot of films based in the French and Indian War, the 1750s, that were made in like the late 30s through to the early 50s. And they all have the British officers in it are always very much of that ilk where they're arrogant, and it has this sort of like they look down on the colonials sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which I thought in this film, I thought that contrasted really interestingly with how the relations between settlers and the Native Americans is actually portrayed, because it shows them as quite integrated, especially with certain tribes. Obviously, there was lines that were drawn between French and British tribes that were supportive. I found that really interesting and it's quite balanced. It's quite an intricate sort of depiction. The shown playing Native American games together at that sort of early settler meeting.
Yeah,
and I suppose a lot of audience then and probably now wouldn't have considered. Everyone, whenever anyone thinks of Native Americans or North American indigenous peoples, everyone always thinks Apaches, Sioux, those classic sort of cowboy and Indian films. Whereas this is a film that's set in New York State, or at the time, New York, the province. It's one of the few films that gives a look at the frontier before it really moved west, which I quite like.
Yeah, they mentioned Algonquin at one point, don't they?
They do, yeah. It's not a completely historically correct sort of film. We can definitely say that much, but it's probably more correct than the original book was. So Mann basically walked a fine line between putting a little bit more historical accuracy, but also trying to keep the plot of the book. There's sort of some really massive disconnects between the book and the film. Production-wise, I suppose we should get back into the production before we move on. Cinematography by Dante Spinotti, who worked with Mann on a lot of films, and he does brilliant work. The cinematography in this is really gorgeous.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
And the locations are amazing. It's mostly shot in the Blue Ridge Mountains, which are in North Carolina rather than New York, but really stunning location stuff. Can anyone guess who the military advisor on the film was?
There's more than one.
There is.
But Dale Dye from Private Ryan is involved.
Yep.
Oh my gosh. It's everywhere. I believe it.
The historical consultant for the military aspects of it was Philip Haythornthwaite. Who's a noted 18th century Napoleonic historian. But Dale Dye was a surprise. I was like, really?
So I know that it won BAFTA for Best Cinematography, and it also picked up an Academy Award for Best Sound. Well deserved. Only Mann's only film that's won an Oscar, which is crazy.
Really? That's amazing. The sound on it is great, though.
The way they sell the gunshots, bullet strikes, and especially impacts from knives, clubs, you name it. Some of it is choreography and good filming and good editing. And some of it is the absolutely sickening noises that the weapons make.
When the gunstock club hits Magwa's shoulder, there's those just, wow, yeah. You can feel it.
Like blunt force trauma, isn't it? It's horrible.
That reviewer talking about how graphic it was, and she's surprised it got a 12. I don't disagree with the latter part, but most of the violence is sold not by straight up gore. There's a very gory shot of that spike protruding from Magwa's back. It's like there's a guy who gets shot in the face at one point, and he's clearly feeling the worst for it, and that's done with some good makeup. But a surprising amount of it is really quite quick cut, and your brain fills it in.
Yeah, you don't see Junkas get his throat slit, for instance, or it's sort of just out of frame. It's
Wes Studi. He sells that scene. He sells it because he gets a little spurt of blood on his face, and that's all you need.
There is I did forget the compound fracture of his arm.
Yeah.
We'll definitely come back to this in fave scenes, because I know we're going to be talking about the promontory scene.
And apparently the Fort William set cost $6 million. Apparently.
Wow.
I can believe that.
And the studio sent like a studio head or studio exec to stand behind Michael Mann to stop him shooting too much, because he was doing like 20 takes of a scene, and they were worried the budget was spiraling. And they'd send a guy, and apparently he sat behind Michael Mann on takes and would just lean in and go, "That's enough, Michael. Move on."
That might explain some of the editing, actually, because some of the editing around the action is a little rough.
Gets choppy, doesn't it, at certain points?
Sometimes that adds to it a little bit, I think.
It mostly does.
Because it's kinetic in the way it's filmed, and it adds a little bit. But I know exactly what you mean. There are some transitions where it's like, And I think that's partially because the film, when he took it to the studio, was 3 hours long, the original cut. By 90s standards, that's very long.
And it can drag a bit. It does drag a bit in places.
What?
Yeah.
Robbie is very critical of films that don't pace well.
Yeah. We'll get back to that one.
The score is gorgeous. Trevor Jones and Randy Eldman worked on the score, so it was mostly Trevor Jones. And because they were recutting everything, the musical cues had to change in some places, and Eldman came in and worked on that. And what I found really interesting was that it was originally going to be like a sort of electronic score, and then they reorchestrated it into a more traditional sort of orchestral thing, and little tinges of that sort of electronic score still in there at times, and you can basically hear what they were going to do, what they were going to be going for. Beautiful main theme, Promontory, which is based on a Dougie McLaren folk song called The Gale, which came out in the early 90s. Just one of my favorite parts of the film is that, the opening sequence where he's running through the brush, and then obviously the promontory scene is spectacular with that score over the top. But yeah, I always thought the score was really great with this movie.
And at one point, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure it's played live within the movie as, in camp kind of thing.
I think it is in the back. Yeah, in the background. Yeah, I think you're right there. The level of detail they went to in some of the sets was quite interesting.
Speaking of detail, and you mentioned advisors and Michael Mann being a certain level, a bit of a Ridley Scott in that he'll pay a lot of attention to some details and then just kind of ignore others.
Yeah.
But we also have a relatively early example of a military boot camp. Well, not just military, but woodsman, mountain man, survivalist boot camp that Day-Lewis was put through for this. And so that was, I had to write this down, Colonel David Webster, who essentially put him to get through a SEER school, survival, evasion, resistance and escape training.
Wow.
And had him, weirdly, I found this fascinating from my perspective and Matt's, trained him with M16, shotguns, pistols, position, hold, moving through cover, that kind of thing, and then went backwards to the muzzle loaders. So he came to it, because one approach would have been to just launch him straight in, don't let him near a modern weapon.
Yeah.
But they got him into the mindset and then went back in time. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, there's some footage of that in the making of documentary, isn't there?
That's where I saw
and
it.
He's there with an M16A1, I think it is, and there's he's got there's a SIG pistol, I think he shoots on a range with, and there's a shotgun in there. It's really interesting that they put him through that. I think that's really, I wonder if that was done on recommendation from people like Dale Dye, or it was just something Mann thought of, or because I don't know when that became an industry practice.
People always talk about Private Ryan in reference to that, and it kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, they did it on A Bridge Too Far as well, the APA.
Right.
Yeah, Attenborough's Private Army. Yeah.
I'd be interested to know the first recognisable movie actor boot camp, when that was. This is relatively early, certainly for an individual sort of lead actor to be put through.
Yeah.
And he bulked up, and he lived somewhat. He did a bit of a Viggo Mortensen and lived with the rifle. And you can really see it. He's so comfortable with that weapon and in that in the costume and in that environment. It really worked, and that's they recognise the value of that now, and they do it with virtually everybody.
I mean, shame his accent wasn't on point as much, because it's a bit over the shop in points.
It is a bit ropey,
a little bit. He sounded like he was from Newcastle in some bits to me. I got really confused because he looks like Andy Carroll anyway, So
I think we can excuse that as an old accent that from the 18th century. That's maybe.
I wasn't thinking that. No, that makes sense then. No, that makes sense.
It's not what it is. That's not what he's doing. He's just doing a mid-Atlantic accent. Not that well.
No, it's a bit ropey. There's some quips in there, aren't there?
My favourite is where he stops him shooting at the running guy and says, "In case your aim's better than your judgment."
Yeah, it's such an Arnie line, isn't it? It's really Arnie.
A bit too sophisticated for Arnie, I think.
Yeah. But I like Hayward's reaction is totally British officer at the time. Just say, "What? What the hell did you say to me?"
Bam.
But I like Hayward's the way he talks is quite accurate for me, and it seems quite accurate. I'll have you beaten from this fort. I love that line. It's just such a he really sells his character. It's a shame that he's not in more like roles like this, because he's really good at them. Yeah,
he has that sort of interesting bit of period drama at the beginning where he's talking to Colonel Monroe's daughter, and he's trying to ask for a hand in marriage, and he very politely gets turned down.
Yeah.
And then later on he gets less politely turned down.
Although not as badly as she turns down Magua.
Oh,
yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
The ultimate snub, isn't it?
I think Madeleine Stowe in this is quite good. I think
she nails that lad with the musket, but with the pistol, doesn't she?
Oh yeah. That headshot, cracking.
Headshot.
Absolutely nails him. Yeah.
Not even aiming properly. Mind you, she's very close.
Great point shooting.
Yeah. Well, she's Munro's daughter, so I assume she's picked it up from him.
Yeah.
So should we move on to plot? So I've got down orphaned, adopted Hawkeye Poe falls in love with the British officer's daughter during the French-Indian War of 1754 to 1763. That's literally the plot. There's nothing else going on, like crazily. There's so much going on in this movie, but yet there's nothing going on as well. The plot is really weak for me this week because I'm just like, okay, so you fall in love with this girl, and I totally get it. She might be the most sophisticated, attractive woman you've ever seen. But how long have you been living there? And you had a family that you were talking to, and I assume that was your love interest. And then you just abandon everything for this woman that you've met like in 2 seconds. But during this really amazing set piece war film, it's just such a weird one.
Yeah, I can understand where you're coming from with that. It's a very interesting plot in that it's very A to B to C, in that it saves them, takes them to the fort, fort's under siege, fort falls, they escape, but don't escape well enough not to be captured. He goes into the village, saves them, but doesn't save them well enough. And then really great ending,
It is almost like a road movie in that respect.
Yeah, it's a road movie through the Blue Ridge Mountains.
Yeah.
Which is gorgeous, and that's not a bad thing.
Well, I was watching film 92 with Barry Norman, and he said that matinee adventure fantasy, that's what he described it as.
It is. It's James Fenimore Cooper who was... they were adventure novels, weren't they, really? More than anything else.
It is an adventure film, though, I think, at heart. It just happens to be set in a war. It's such an interesting film. But as a complete novice to the period, it was just nice to... obviously know a little bit about that era, but it was nice to see it represented in film.
It's very rare, to be honest. There's very few films that focus on the French and Indian Wars. You've got Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy, which is a great film from 1940. That's Rogers Rangers. Then you've got Drums Along the Mohawk, which was 1939, with Henry Fonda. We've already mentioned Gary Cooper in the earlier adaptation, but he was also in The Unconquered. And then there's the Allegheny Uprising with John Wayne.
Wow.
All in this sort of tight sort of late 30s, 40s period. So it must have been one of those eras where American cinema-going audiences were interested in that sort of period, which I thought was really interesting.
For me, the plot, I think what they've tried to do, if the book is clearly, I've never read it and I never will.
No, I haven't read it either.
Everyone says it's terrible. But it's iconic and has spawned all of these other adaptations. And so you're kind of saddled with this very limited plot. And what they've tried to do is recenter it on the Native American place in the world, or place in America, and how that was under attack. And so you always can't get away from a very lightweight plot. And so I think they did more than the best of it. I think they turned it into almost turned it into something different. And maybe the thing to do would have been to have made a different film. But this thing is like a Rolling Stone that's gathered moss, hasn't it? For some people, it's
it's a really great way of putting it. Yeah,
iconic. So I quite like the way. So it doesn't really subvert the novel, but it does its own thing with it.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, the novel's based loosely around the siege of Fort William Henry in 1757, which it does say in the film. But obviously, that siege was a little bit different in that the massacre that followed it, that is depicted in the film, wasn't quite as complete as it's portrayed in the film. Only about 180 were killed.
Right.
And Monroe, obviously, he didn't actually die during that massacre. He died a few months later in Albany.
Spoiler alert, guys. Come on.
I know, exactly. So there's interesting sort of disconnects from the history and from the book. I mean, as I was saying, it's sort of one of the few films which is made about the period, and it's definitely one of the few modern films that have been made about the period.
Yeah.
And it does a fairly good job, I think, at sort of representing that conflict. There's some little bits where I would disagree with what's portrayed, sort of like the ambush scene at the beginning. They've gone for portraying the British as being very linear, which by 1757 they'd definitely learnt their lessons from Braddock's massacre, essentially, when he was retreating from Monongahela. By the middle of that war, they'd taken on that, what was then known as the Indian way of war, and they'd taken on sort of the light infantry, use cover, move. Definitely don't all stand shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah, not in column.
Space out a bit.
Yeah.
You know.
So I guess in movie terms, that's what people think of.
Yeah.
When you think of that war, you're probably not thinking French-Indian War. You're probably thinking Napoleonic War, and that's your sort of pin
for that period. You know, you see muskets, you think Napoleonic.
Yeah, you see muskets and tricorn hats, you think Napoleonic era, whether you're right or wrong. So to have guys in column, firing in line, is just what people expect, I guess, when muskets are brought in. And maybe for an American audience, it's the War of Independence that is in their head. So they're thinking it in that sense.
Yeah.
You know, maybe they're just turning up to see English troops get killed because they don't like redcoats. It's sort of...
Well, they also forget that in the American War of Independence, most of the casualties were inflicted by either side in linear warfare, not in hiding behind trees, being because that's, you know, you generally met on the field and had a battle.
Had it out, yeah. And the movie teases it, and it really annoys me. It teased it. I got really annoyed at that bit.
You know, like the light infantry stuff that Matt's talking about, we could do that by then. We knew how to do that by then, and we were fighting on those terms where appropriate.
Daniel Day-Lewis Poe, he even mentions, like, you have to get away from their skirmishers when they're trying to escape the fort later on in the movie. He's like, there's an outpost here, and then he mentions the skirmishers. So I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Then someone who's written this does have a knowledge of that era.
Although he probably means pickets, but yeah.
Yeah, but I assumed it was people with, like, you know, it was just troops acting on their own initiative.
That's a great scene, which I think we'll talk about in fave scenes. But
yeah, so I think we should move on to Ali Tally, because the plot this week it's not the strongest, but there's a lot going on, and we'll get into it.
It's time for Ali Tally on Fighting on Film.
So, Jonathan, as our guest this week, we'd love to hear your Ali first.
I've got a bit of a two-tier one, because I think the star of the show for me has to be The Rifle. I believe is called Killdeer, but I don't think that's ever said on camera.
I don't think so, but that's interesting.
Gripped. It's certainly what it was dubbed either between Michael Mann and the guy that made it, who was a chap called Wayne Watson. There's a whole story here that we haven't got time to go into, where another rifle maker, because of course there have been almost continuously guys who have the skill to make lock, stock and barrel and build it into a rifle with the same skill as someone from 200, 300 years ago. And so they sought out a guy to do that. And the two rifles he provided that were authentic to period, Michael Mann he liked them. In fact, he kept them, apparently, but he did not use them. And he went out to this Wayne Watson chap to create something that was actually a Pennsylvania rifle of about 1820. And that's what Killdeer is.
Right.
But having so it's 50, 60 years out of date, and visibly so if you know your long rifle or 18th century rifles. But it's so beautifully made and so well handled and so prominent. It's an extension of the character. It's about as Ali as an 18th century or early 19th century design can get. So that's my vote. And then there's a particular scene involving it. I can save that for later, or we can talk about it now.
Go for it.
Yeah.
I actually had an inquiry about this, believe it or not, from a member of the public at the museum. And I realized that I knew what he was talking about, but I hadn't ever looked into it. And so I did. And this is the fort scene, the courier scene that you're talking about. So he's preparing actually multiple rifles. And this is where the editing doesn't quite flow. Because they've cut it up and put stuff a bit out of order, I think. So they're preparing different weapons. There's more than one of them. And the idea is to cover this guy as he gets away from the fort. Brilliant scene. And like all the other scenes involving the rifles in particular, you really get the sense of the skill, experience, and the effort required to accurately fire a shot with a weapon. It's very hard to depict that. He does it in Heat with the FNC.
Yes.
Just that moment of quiet and still, and bam, and you get that in this.
Yeah.
And so the bit I'm blithering toward is he gets a length of silk, and he's kind of quietly cutting this piece of silk clothing in the prior scene, actually, and you don't really notice what he's doing.
Yeah, he says, "Do you mind?" and he takes off a shelf, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, is that what that is for? Okay, yeah. I thought it was a bit of bandage. Like I thought he'd nicked himself on the way in or something. Ah, okay.
That's exactly what it looks like in the scene. But then you realise later, or if you care enough, you go back and look, and he has it on his kit. And then what he's doing, and this should really have happened in a different sequence, but he actually, with his knife, cuts a patch of silk, and then he would have loaded the bullet on top of that. We'll obviously pour the powder in first, and the idea, and he actually says another 40 yards, I think is the line.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah,
which is, as presented, nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can't get another 40 yards by adding a silk patch, unless the idea was you were just patching the gap, because it creates it reduces what's called the windage, so the gap around the bullet, and prevents some of the gases being wasted as they go past. But so that's true of any patch. So riflemen would use patches.
Silk or no,
exactly.
Yeah.
Now the argument presented, if you like, is that it's silk and is a tight weave. A little more loosely woven piece of cloth might be less efficient, but there's no way you're getting an extra 40 yards out of it, out of just that. But having gone back to the script, originally it was just a tightly woven cloth, and he wets it. And there's something called spit patching that is done today and was almost certainly done then.
Yeah.
But the critical thing is that they do specify a stouter charge of powder as well.
Okay.
So he's getting his extra 40 yards from more gunpowder.
Right.
Plus a little bit more, and maybe a little bit more precision from his wet, tight woven patch.
That's so interesting because,
wow.
I mean, as you mentioned there, the editing is a little bit off because it kind of goes straight to the frizzen. After he's cut it, it doesn't show him putting the ball and seating the ball and ramming it down. It sort of, the camera cuts to a close-up of the lock.
It's weirder than that, actually. It shows, having just watched it again, I paid particular attention to this scene again, and I'm pretty sure it's the same rifle as in his rifle.
Mm.
And he's shown ramming. Then it cuts to him cutting the silk.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah,
which is the wrong way around because it's too late now.
Yeah.
Then it cuts to him tapping priming powder into the pan. So it's in completely the wrong order, unless it's like a montage of him loading different weapons. But I don't think it is. I think it's just an editing goof.
I think it is too.
Because it can. Now you say it, I got really confused in that scene because he was getting handed so many rifles that it was lost on me that he'd put even.
And is it the long rifle that he fires last at that last shot? Okay, good. We got that right at least.
Yeah, because I assume he fired it first, and then by the time that he'd fired all those others, his was ready to shoot again. Surely they'd have to show one of his mates putting the silk in.
Yeah,
because he didn't load. Yeah.
I think the other two are muskets.
Right.
Do you know? I'm not even sure. I'd have to go back again and my impression was that they might be rifles as well. That they could in fact be fowling pieces.
They could, yeah.
Which were often used. In fact, I only learned recently were used in the English Civil War as well as a sort of sharpshooter's weapon.
Right.
And you can get up to 100 yards. You can be as good as a military rifle with one of those.
Because the muskets are lasers in this movie. Like, one thing that I did sort of notice, it's got that trope of extremely accurate musketry in certain sequences.
The ranges aren't too bad, though.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that me sort of thinking something from history and then putting it into a movie? And is that just a cliché wrong there?
Partly that maybe, but I'm trying to think. I'm struggling to think of a scene where musketry is shown to be very accurate.
You see, so this is me getting my muskets and my rifles mixed up because I don't know enough
think
about the
so.
period.
Yeah.
This is the episode that ruins the FOF podcast. I'm just getting two firearms experts and someone who's read Saul David's All the King's Men, and it just goes all to pot.
No, I know what you're saying, Rob. So what you're thinking of is the musketry from the linear formations, the red coats, isn't particularly accurate because they're basically in every scene they're seen blasting foliage. That's what their main task seems to be. And then there's Hawkeye and the guys that are firing. I think they're mostly rifles. There might be one or two that are sort of trade muskets, Fowler's type, but they're very accurate.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
I think that's because they're patching and the ranges that they're shooting at aren't super long.
Yeah, there aren't. Yeah, actually, no, there aren't many long range shots attempted. It's just that one shot when he's the courier, isn't it? And he nails the guy.
Yeah, and it puts that sort of nice emphasis on it where it slows everything down. There's the music gets a little bit quieter, and we get that panning shot along the length of the barrel up to, the lock in his trigger finger, and
that's it. That's the heat shot, isn't it? Yeah,
it's the heat shot. It's the 18th century heat shot. And the picket, the guy that was chasing the courier, just gets knocked down, and he even has a squib because a little patch of red appears on his chest, which I thought was a neat.
I've learned the difference between muskets and rifles today, even though I should have known it anyway.
Jonathan, do you want to explain the difference between a musket and a rifle?
Yeah,
as you're the ranking firearms expert here.
About that,
don't put yourself down, Matt. God.
Yeah.
Next week, me and
I haven't
Jonathan,
got the title keeper of firearms and artillery. So
you heard it here, folks. From next week, it's just me and Jonathan because Matt's just
I don't think Jonathan has the time, but if he wants to,
take that degree down off your wall, Matt. Take that degree down. You've just ruined your whole professional lineage here.
Difference between a rifle and a musket.
Yeah.
Right, so actually, people don't realise this, but rifle is technically short for rifle gun, unless it's short for rifle musket. Because a gun is, well, everyone knows what a gun is. If you put a spiral groove in the barrel, originally termed screwing, so a screwed gun, that gives you accuracy because it spin stabilizes the bullet. So very early, originally it would have been called a screwed gun or a screwed birding piece or fowling piece or whatever the thing might be.
You can see why they went with rifle.
Yes,
it's a shame, really. The opportunity is lost now. But so that sometime about the 1680s that they start using the term rifled, which is from like you rifle through a drawer, you rifle a palace of its loot.
Yeah.
Rifle the barrel.
So you're pulling out material when you're rifling.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The main thing is the rifled bore, which you can't see from the outside, of course. And so in the movie, you can spot the rifles because they're shorter. They have a dropped, curved stock. If you think of something like a Winchester later on, that still has a hint of that dropped down stock, which positions your eye behind the sights, which for a musket is not really at all important.
Yeah.
So in this context, they're shorter, they've got sights, they've got a dropped butt stock. And as Matt says, though, some of them look like they could be something a bit different. And a fowling piece, you don't really know whether that's a rifle or not without getting up close and personal with it.
So there you go. Basically, a musket is a smooth bore, a barrel that isn't rifled, hence is less accurate. Because there's no spin imparted on the ball.
I must bore you briefly further with musket is technically just a military long gun, which is why you have the phrase rifle musket.
Okay.
Yes.
So very quickly that falls away because all muskets are rifles, and it's just more convenient to call them all rifles, if that makes sense.
Right.
So for a period of time we have rifle muskets because we used to have, musket is. This is why we still have the term musketry later. Because it's the application of military infantry long gun fire, and it doesn't matter whether it's rifled or not technically.
Mm-hmm.
This is great. This is why I love doing this, because I'm like, I just watched the movie, but now I'm learning all about this. This is fantastic. Great.
Whether you want it or not.
Proper terminology, and now everyone knows what the difference between a a smoothbore, a musket, and a rifle is.
There we go. You don't get that on other film pods.
You definitely bloody don't get that on other film pods.
So, Matt, your alley this week.
Okay, this is a bit contentious because it doesn't appear in every cut of the film. During the siege sequence, that part where Jonathan's just mentioned, where the courier tries to break off and get to Fort Edward, I think it is, Monroe says that Major Hayward will provide a diversion, a distraction. And in the version that's on Netflix and the version that's often shown on TV, a lot has been cut and spliced and changed. In the version I had as a kid, which was on VHS, or maybe DVD, I don't remember, but I vividly remember the diversion being briefly shown. So it's like it's a very short shot of Hayward with a line of grenadiers, and one of the grenadiers behind him is armed with a flintlock hand mortar, which is essentially an 18th century grenade launcher. Everyone often forgets that grenades have been around a lot longer than the 19th, 20th century.
Yeah. And
they date back into the 1500s, probably even earlier. And they're often made from either iron or little bits of pot. By this point, they're predominantly iron, and they're fragmentation weapons. So you light a little fuse, you pop it in the very short barrel of your hand mortar, and then your hand mortar is a flintlock, much like the muskets and fowling pieces and rifles shown in the film. And then you fire that, and then it projects it downrange, hopefully landing amongst your enemies and doing all kinds of chaos and damage. But it's so briefly seen in the director's cut of the movie, but it's just too cool not to mention, because I can't think of any other film where it appears. If you don't know what it is, you're just sat there thinking, why is that man holding a very stubby gun?
I mean, I'd never even seen one until Matt sent me a photo. And then obviously you scour the film, and on function the Netflix version doesn't have it on there, but
not just including it, but making it.
Oh yeah.
It's probably been adapted from an existing prop musket, but the actual muzzle section has been fabricated.
Often made of brass, weren't they, the original ones? And
yeah, we've got quite a few different flavors of this. We've even got one where the cup launcher, if you like, is built into the butt stock.
Oh right.
Now my impression I haven't really researched this in any depth, and if you've come across references, Matt, let me know. My impression is that virtually all of these, whether they're little stubby launchers like the one that you can see on IMFDB, if you go on there, if you can't see it on Netflix.
Yeah, sadly.
Or the thing I've just described, the standard version seems to have been a naval thing. Not heard tell of them being used for land service.
I haven't looked at in too much depth, but from when I did my my undergraduate dissertation, well, it was about light infantry tactics, mostly in North America.
Mm-hmm.
And in that came about, the other end of the flank companies is the grenadiers. By that point, by the 1770s, then there's nothing like that anymore. They're not even carrying grenades at that point. The French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, I've never seen an actual account of a grenade being used from a launcher in North America, and I don't even know how widely they were used prior. So 1740s, etc. But yeah, I've never seen in-depth research on them. So it was just a really interesting thing that I saw it in the film. I remember that was in the film, and thankfully someone did capture it and put it online.
Yeah.
So it confirmed it for me.
And at the very least, it's plausible, because we've got at least one that we date to about 1740, and it looks very much like the one in the movie. It's just a bit shorter, actually.
So for me this week, I mean, I've got a question to ask John, and I've got my own alley pick. So I'll go with my own alley pick. It's the Gunstock War Club that we see.
Awesome.
That Maguire gets taken out with at the end of the movie. It's just an amazing looking bit of kit. I've never seen one before. Yeah, it looks like a gun stock. It looks like sort of, I mean, to me, it looked like a matchlock sort of type stock in a way. It's got that really sort of angled design, and I can sort of see why you'd make it like that, because it's a really good sort of ergonomic design for swinging and hitting people with, and it's got little tomahawks on it, and it's in a lot from a lot of contemporary things that I found is that there's a drawing from Fort William siege of the French troops trying to stop their Native American allies attacking the British column, and there's a guy swinging one in that sketch. As we say with the cinematography, they're taking cues from paintings. I wonder if the reason it's included in the movie is because there's sketches from the time of showing them in use.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a great inclusion. I mean, I've never seen one in any movie before. It's just a really, really interesting little inclusion. And even though it is really cool, it gets used really sparingly, but in a good way.
Yeah, you get that first bit of it during the first ambush when he throws it, and that's like, wow, okay.
It's like so good, isn't it?
It's a very cool weapon, and I think it's such an interesting thing where, again, the European influence on native culture comes in, where they've been inspired by the shape of a gun stock to make a melee weapon from that shape. I just think that's I haven't looked into it, but watching the film again, I was like, I need to look into that and see if anyone's written anything interesting about it, because I want to know more about what that is and why they did that.
There's so much to go on tangents from this movie. I think that's one of the strengths of it. My question for John is, I was reading up some weapons that were used in the film, and then there was, the different rifles and now muskets. I'm glad we cleared that up earlier. But I came across trade muskets, and I'd never heard of like what they were before. Trade muskets, I mean, where do they come from?
The IMFDB thing is a bit curious in that they're very confident that these are trade muskets. And I suppose they probably are. As we've established, it's quite hard to tell. Some of these things might be fowling pieces, not so much muskets. So I suppose there's a spectrum. If you think of modern rifles, AR-15s can be both military rifles or civilian rifles, and sometimes the visual difference is very little. And the same is kind of true here. So a trade musket is simply a musket that's been traded.
Okay, fair enough.
So that means they might look exactly like a Brown Bess.
Right.
And the only difference would be the markings. It wouldn't have Tower, George, or whichever the monarch is at the time, monogram cipher on the lock, and the various little broad arrow ownership acceptance marks and the military proof marks. They'd have civilian proof marks or no proof marks. A lot of trade muskets, certainly later on, didn't see proof and so might blow up, because that's really what they are: cheap Poundland versions.
Love it.
Of a musket, or maybe they're more like a Fowler, but typically they have the look of a musket because that's what they wanted.
It's like a famous design that everyone knows the look of, sort of thing.
Yeah, looks like a Brown Bess, looks like a Charleville. Same thing when you go on wish.com and you buy something that looks like something else and it's not as good.
I just find it really interesting. It's nice the movie takes the time to sort of showcase all these different weapons and doesn't just stick with the old classics. Sort of like in cowboy movies, everyone's got a certain type of revolver, things like that. At least this film does go out of its way to present some really interesting firearms.
There's a really good variety, actually. Some of them, you call them trade muskets. They might have been locally made.
Yeah, it makes sense for the militia, because they bang on about protecting their homes and they've all got weapons, so it makes perfect sense. But I just thought it was a really interesting little thing.
It's a cost thing as well. So if you think about it in the reality of the period, so if you can't afford a handmade fowling piece, then you might get a trade gun.
Yep.
It's the same now with Jonathan mentioned AR-15s. You can get mil-spec AR-15s, and then you can get AR-15s that aren't mil-spec. And mil-spec has come to be this sort of standard that you look for because it's what the military spec is.
That makes sense. So that alley tally this week was absolutely fascinating. I learned so much. I think we'll move on to favourite scenes.
Yeah. John, what's your favourite scene from the film? As a guest, you have to go first. It's the law.
Well, I've kind of cheated in that I combined the alley bit of kit with one of my favourite scenes. But then I suppose because I'm a bit critical of it, it can't be my true favourite. And my true favourite is, there's all sorts of analogies you could think of, but it's like the 18th century version of the Matrix lobby scene. And it is the promontory, the running up the mountainside, smoking fools left, right, and centre, melee combat, New York reloads, a dual wield with two rifles at one point, which is not entirely plausible in that he's hip firing and not even looking, and he takes out two guys who must be set, a number of feet apart.
This is
He is Hawkeye, don't forget.
Yeah.
It's Hawkeye, so we let him off. But it's kind of got it all, and the build of the music, the way it's filmed. There's no issues, I don't think, with the editing there.
No.
Except what I've one complaint, and that's that in the behind the scenes they talk about one of the many things Daniel Day-Lewis trained to do was to reload on the run.
Wow.
And see him do that very briefly, but you don't see him complete it. In fact, you really only see a hint of him starting to do it, and then it cuts. And to try and keep that Michael Mann fast-paced feel, we lose what could have been a really amazing sort of feat. Really,
I wonder if Daniel Day-Lewis can still do that.
That'd be amazing if he can.
Maybe he never quite nailed it.
Yeah. Oh, I've dropped my powder. Oh, wait.
Well, I think that whole scene, the choreography of it is amazing. And in the behind the scenes stuff, which is up on YouTube, you do see him practicing some of those moves that he does. In the central ambush, the massacre scene. There's that great scene where he cuts like someone's tendons behind their knee.
Oh yeah,
that's
horrible.
That's a hell of a scene. And you see him practicing that a couple of times, and you see him actually doing the reload practice. There's a little clip of it. It doesn't show you the whole thing.
There's a lot of running in this movie.
Yeah, there is
a lot of running, and it culminates in the ultimate scene of running, where, as I say, it's like, or you could compare it to the Circle Club in the first John Wick movie, where it's just a highly skilled guy moving from A to B, wasting people, and it's amazing.
He does go a bit like Rambo, doesn't he? A little bit. Like, goes a bit one man army. But there's one bit, and I'm sticking in my craw, and I have to say it. In that sequence where Daniel Day's just knocked out half that column of lads, and they go through a little cave clearing to get to where Mogwai's trying to kill Unax, and Daniel Day-Lewis brushes up against the side of a rock, and it's not a rock, it's like a piece of like cloth or like rubber, like tarpaulin or something, and it just judders. There's a separate scene.
Ruin the whole film for you, hasn't it, bro?
But there's a separate scene where someone's running past it, and it clearly is like a bit of rock, just a bit of like fake rock pulled over a frame or something.
Can I just say, I know Matt said before we went live that he knew that and was looking for it and didn't see it. I didn't know that, and so didn't look for it, but I just Googled it, and the top result is a YouTube video, 18 seconds long, called, hilariously, Last Fake Rock of the Mohicans.
That's fantastic. I love it.
There's supposed to be a chain link fence at the beginning of the film, where he begins the deer hunt. There's supposed to be just in the corner of the shot, there's a chain link fence. And then as they're marching out from the surrender of the fort, apparently there's a couple of propane tanks visible at one point. It's not as bad as the guy wearing jeans in the Gladiator, though, is it? I mean,
yeah. It's just a great little gaff. It
is, but that whole scene,
it's fantastic, isn't it?
It still gives me goosebumps. That and the ambush at the beginning, which I think Rob's going to talk about in a second.
Yeah,
they both. Yeah, every time I watch them, I'm like, damn, this is so well done. One thing that I did think about watching that is there's a bit where he sort of like hits a guy in the face with his rifle. I've always been struck by long rifles always seem quite fragile, so I always think they're always gonna break this, because the stocks are so thin on them. There's a lot of hand to hand in that film where you think,
no, I think that's legitimate. If you, especially the more nicely made ones, the more wood you remove to make them look nice, the more chance of it breaking.
Yeah.
But this is why things like Brown Bess are big and clunky. It's the Brown Bess is the AK of the 18th and 19th century.
It is, and I can't let this podcast go without asking Jonathan to briefly try and explain to us where the name Brown Bess comes from, because he wrote a paper on this and it's very good.
Surprisingly straightforward. People can write thousands of words about it apparently, but it's actually really straightforward. There've been lots of attempts to explain it, a bit like hence the expression thing of. It was named after Queen Elizabeth, hence Beth.
Yeah,
and named after its browned barrel. Well, the barrels weren't browned. There's some of them even more ridiculous than that. I can't bring them to mind at the moment, but it's actually really straightforward. It's the fact that the stock is brown, but also the dual meaning of the word brown, which originally meant ordinary, and Bess being a sort of generic nickname for a woman, a sort of ordinary woman, a common woman, camp follower, a prostitute maybe.
Yeah.
Who might be also tanned from the sun. So potentially the gun's brown, the woman's a bit brown, and she's brown in the sense of being ordinary. Bess.
That makes sense to me. Yeah.
And it's almost definitively that. I mean, often it's very hard to be definitive about these things, but we have enough sources going far enough back to be pretty damn sure that that's what this means.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
That's great.
This is the only movie podcast you will ever hear someone explain what a brown Bess is to you.
And this is a great episode this week. People are getting, taught about musketry and rifles, and this is why we love doing it, because we love to do the movie, but we also get all these extra great little bits of history on top, and it's exactly why we do it.
Definitely.
So, rabbit holes.
Yeah, exactly. And you'd be silly not to go down them.
So what's yours, Rob? What's your favourite scene?
As I say at the start, I had only seen it a couple of times for the podcast. And I'm choosing the ambush at the start because I wasn't expecting it. And it really came out of the blue because, I'll get into it later. I think the pacing at times could do with a little bit of a trim. And I already know they've trimmed
That's what the studio said as well.
Yeah, exactly. I'm that bloke guy, Michael Mann. I'm him. But I was thinking, oh, come on. I'm begging for something to happen at this point, nearly half an hour in. So Magwai is attached as a scout to Hayward's column that are going to reinforce Fort William Henry. So Cora complains about being tired, and they say, can we stop, to Hayward? And he's like, yes, scout, we're going to stop here. And Magwai goes, no, up here is much better to, rest. It's like a clearing. It's much nicer. So, okay, like nothing untoward there. Hayward's clearly a little bit annoyed, but they keep going up the little passageway through the woods, and then Magwai sort of walks back towards the end of the column, and you're thinking, okay, nothing wrong there. He's just going to check behind the column to see if anything's going on. At this point, he's not the movie's antagonist. He's just a new character, and then he drops a little tomahawk by the side of his thigh, and I'm like, oh, hang on, okay, and then you get the really sort of low sound, sort of the soundtrack starts to kick in a little bit. You think, okay, something's coming. And he absolutely wallops this poor redcoat in the neck.
He's so shocked, isn't he? Poor lad.
That poor little lad. He literally, I think he's only he mustn't be at nearly 20 or something. It's really young. Magwai lets rip with a musket from his waist, hip fires it. And then this is where the editing annoyed me. Because I'm thinking, well, Magwai's toast. There's 20 redcoats around him. We're going to batter him to death with their brown besses. But he vanishes. So I assume he ran up into the ridge line or something. And then all hell breaks loose. And Magwai's mates come out of the tree line and start absolutely caning this little company of redcoats they just get routed, don't they, really quickly. I assumed Hayward was green. I assumed he didn't know what he was doing. And he's trying to protect the two women. And I'm like, well, you're going to be toast as well, mate, in a minute. And then, oh no, Hawkeye comes and saves the day. Hooray. It's just a great little scene. And especially when Daniel Day comes in, because he starts really choreographed fighting these people. And the redcoats didn't try choreographed fighting, that they just got killed. And they should have tried choreographed fighting off their assailants.
If only they tried some choreography, God damn it.
Yeah, the British Army should have been training that, really. Take the King Shilling and some choreographed fighting exercises, please. And it sets the tone for every other set piece after, because the set pieces ramp and then they ramp again, and you get that battle at the end. But as an opening set piece to any film, it's a great one.
Yeah, for sure.
You just made me realize something that is kind of missing from the movie, but I think you can kind of explain it. Very little bayonet action. Some of them end up with them on, but you don't see them use them, really.
Because Hayward just calls them to make ready and fire in that sequence. He doesn't say fix bayonets, which is the first thing you'd do. There's always lads sort of readying their brown besses as clubs. Is there not an order for that? Because they seem to do it quite quick, some of them.
There's a lot to say in this sequence, which cinematically is brilliant, and I love it.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
I love the bit where the score's pounding and Daniel Day-Lewis and the lads just come charging through. That's great. And they just start ripping Huron apart because
that's fun.
Yeah, exactly.
Away the lads.
Exactly. Yeah, Daniel Day-Lewis definitely shouted away the lads before they came in.
Lads.
And I like your theory, Rob, that Hayward is green. He's fresh off the boat. He's just arrived from England. It's interesting because they are fighting as they would have fought before any of the experience of fighting in North America. So those lads are supposed to be the 60th Royal American Regiment, which were much later, a light infantry regiment. But at this point, they're a line regiment. Well, at this point in the war, they're fairly experienced in how to fight. That ambush is an allusion to Braddock's defeat at Monongahela, where they did fight in linear formations in close quarters. And an interesting thing that the film doesn't portray, it doesn't show the Indians firing from the tree line. Instead, the natives come in and it's hand-to-hand melee quite quickly after the first volley. Whereas at Monongahela, they picked off the densely packed infantry over a course of hours. And you can't advance linear infantry into a tree line because it'll just break up, and then all of the training that they've done for years previously evaporates. And it wasn't until fighting in North America became a serious prospect that was faced by larger numbers of the British Army, because previously it had been mostly like a colonial settler type militia that had fought a lot of the smaller wars with the French and with the native inhabitants. At this point, there's a lot of British soldiers in North America, and they're having to learn how to fight in this completely different, quite confined sort of landscape where it's trees, there's brush, there's foliage, lots of cover, and they're fighting an enemy that is totally skilled in light infantry warfare. And they've honed these skills from fighting each other and through hunting.
If that's true, and I think it probably is now that we've dissected it a little bit. But if you're a redcoat, fresh off the boat, and so you're not fighting another line, you're fighting someone who's running at you you don't know what weapons they've got, you don't know what their fighting style is going to be like. You know, they're not even wearing like a regimented uniform. That's really got to shit you up in that split second. You're not going to know what to do.
Well, yeah, definitely. There's a psychological aspect to it, most definitely, because you're fighting an enemy which is, everyone's told you are savages. At that point, what would have probably been more likely is they would have opened ranks and moved forward.
Yeah, and to meet them with bayonet.
The fire control would have been better. But it's a great scene. I really like it, and there's interesting little historical caveats you can take from it.
Oh yeah, you told me he's got a saber when he shouldn't have a saber.
Oh yeah, Hayward has a saber where he would have probably had a spadroon.
So Matt, favorite scene?
My favorite scene, I think, is, I love the ambush in the center of the film, but I really love the siege, and it's probably one of the few films to bother representing, or that would need to represent, because there's not that many films about the period, like we said earlier. But it's one of the few films that portray an 18th century siege to the point where you have large siege guns. They talk about digging saps forward, counter fire, counter battery fire, and then they do quite a detailed little shot of them loading mortars.
Yeah,
which is again very rare in films, and they do quite the mortars are very OP. They're very overpowered in this. So like as soon as the mortars are there, then that's it. It's game over.
Yeah,
which is true. That is something that was true of sieges of the period, but they do lay waste pretty quickly, and that's more or less one of the things I like about that film, is that they spent that $6 million and showed that scale. So there's loads of extras running around carrying ordnance. Mentioned it earlier. There's lots of guys running around inside the fort itself, and it even shows them aiming at one of the saps. There's a sequence where they aim at one of the saps where the guys are digging the trench forward to get the mortars in position. And
that's where the movie changes, though. The movie goes from adventure film that could be a frontier sort of movie, but it doesn't do that. It just flips on its head, and it just becomes like, oh, it's a siege movie now. And you get that beautiful sweeping shot of all the French troops coming up, and then you've got, Hawkeye and the main cast in the canoe coming up the river. So they're seeing it from a completely different angle. So you get to see it from a different angle. Everything is thought of, and as we say, the cinematography is really good. But the sense of scale there is just it's off the charts.
Yeah, the bit where they come out of the woods and they see the flashes in the distance.
Yeah, really nice.
That's really something. It's a very well done sort of sequence, and probably $6 million well spent, I would say.
Definitely. And I've got to give an honourable mention for the last battle when the column are attacked. The way that the musket fire, rifle fire, where all the puffs of smoke come out of the tree line, and the column realise that they're under attack, and it goes from like one or two little cracks to a crescendo volley.
Yep.
And it just sounds so good.
And you get that lovely shot of the whole column.
Yeah.
And you see like the independent companies, they're more like platoon size, but they're supposed to be companies, sort of returning fire.
And you've got lads panicking in the middle, holding their brown besses ready, like to hit people with.
No CGI to do this in post. This all had to be choreographed. Only so many takes to be able to pull that off.
Oh, there is one awful bit of CGI though. Did you see the bit with the waterfall? The waterfall.
Is that CGI?
It looks really weird. It looks like it's like a paint, like a bad blue screen.
I'm pretty sure I know what that is, and it's because there's a similar waterfall scene in Predator where it suddenly goes to a totally different film stock. It might even be stock footage filmed for something else, or a reshoot or something. I think that's what it is.
Damn, Michael Mann ran out of money to shoot a waterfall. He spent $6 million on Fort Henry. We ain't got no money left.
I do love your 1930s film exec voice. It's
anytime it's an executive decision, the 30s film man comes out.
Even better than Daniel Day-Lewis's American accent.
that 3 years doing that drama degree was well spent.
It was. That scene is great because you get all of those. There must be at least 300 people in that scene plus.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And the choreographing of getting them all to begin firing at the right time, it must have been mind blowing, like you say, Jonathan. And what I always liked about that is that you see the two daughters sort of like ride off towards the Indians and then get off their horse, which is exactly what I would not have ever have done. I would have continued to ride my horse away.
They have to do that so Daniel Day-Lewis can come in and stake his claim.
Oh, it's true.
The love interest. Yeah, because the only reason a lot of people do the certain things in this movie that they do is because it has to drive the plot. And there's certain points where, especially that battle scene, it's not really the plot anymore. It's just a really nice battle sequence.
Yeah.
And they have to sort of ground it somewhere.
One of the parts I do like about that Maurice Roves is on horseback, Cale Munro, and a Huron jumps on the back of his horse and tries to stab him. And he blocks the hatchet with his sword, takes a horse pistol and shoots him round his body.
That's so cool.
It's a very hardcore moment, and it just goes to show that Cale Munro knew what he was doing, because he is there. He's sabering these attacking Huron. We can't not discuss the fact that Magua shoots his horse from under him.
Yes,
and then comes and carves its heart out.
Oh yeah,
and
very
that
metal.
is cool. That is. I remember watching that as a kid, going, "Oh my god!"
Yeah,
and just being totally shocked.
Was it something that I'll make sure that I kill your daughters or your offspring, so there's no seedling left or something? I'm like, Jesus Christ, you really hate this bloke, don't you?
So in the film, Magua's entire sort of motivation is that he doesn't like what the British are doing to his people.
Yeah,
which is a fair point.
And I completely sided with him.
But what is interesting is that in the book, the reason he hates Munro is because he got him addicted to firewater.
Oh.
Yes. Oh. So apparently in the book, he hates Munro because he got him individually addicted to gambling and firewater. So there's no higher moral. It's just a you've really ruined me as a person. I want my revenge type deal.
Because that's one of the things that makes it so interesting, and to dare I use the P word, progressive, for the early 90s, because the Native Americans are shown as more complex, and some of them are trying to he specifically is wanting to look, see what the white man's doing. We can do that, and we can have power.
the scene in the village later on, he completely lays it all out, doesn't he? It's like, we can trade, we can be as powerful as the whites, etc. I think he says, or something along those
Some of
lines.
the tribes were, at least for a time.
Mm.
I also really like the depiction of the Native Americans fully embracing firearms, which they did.
Yeah.
Because why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Whereas often, and we often see them without, or maybe a couple have got. It's later on, and they've got some Winchesters or something.
Mm.
They kept what worked for them, but they also adapted to what was new and capable, and they use it to great effect. So I can forgive some of the tired tropes of how British infantry are depicted.
Yeah.
But how the Indians are depicted.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's
really
a good point.
Really good. So as usual, we've crept into final thoughts while we were doing the final scenes, and that's usually how it goes. Jonathan, final thoughts?
One of many of my favourite films where a lot of the details are wrong, and the more you look, the more you'll see.
Yeah.
But the overall impression is just spot on, and you feel like you're watching something from history.
For me, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I didn't expect a lot going in, but I really, really enjoyed it. Once the sort of initial half hour out the way, get the ambush out the way, get to the siege, then I was invested. Early on, I was like, oh, okay, where's this going to go? Like, I must admit, I went off and made a cup of tea and came back. So I had to go back a little bit where I'd missed. So I missed the siege bit. So I was like, what? They're in a fort now? Because I didn't know they'd moved on. I was, to go back.
There's a pause button.
I know there is, but I hit mute and I think it's pause and I come back and
That's dangerous. Good God.
I know. As I say, it's a Michael Mann film. I mean, if that doesn't sell it for you, if you're a fan of Heat, watch this.
Yeah, this is 18th century Heat.
It literally is.
And if you're not, you should be.
Yes, very true. For me, you nailed it on the head, John, when you said that it creates that overall impression of the period, and I think it does that really well. There's lots of little bits you could pick out. Costume wise, it's quite good, but if you really zoom on it, you see like some of the bits of uniform are a bit off. Some of the drills aren't correct, obviously, but that's a very difficult thing to do for a big production like this, in that it takes a desire to do that, a desire to get every sort of minute thing right, which often isn't there with filmmaking. But it does create that overall impression. And it's such an amazing piece of cinema in its locations, its landscapes, and the way it shoots them. The depth of the choreography that goes into those battles and those fight scenes, so impressive. And then you get that brilliant sort of sweeping feel throughout the film, where it's an epic adventure. You're following these people through a wilderness, which it's also a wilderness that doesn't get explored very often. It's the frontier before everything moved west, before the mid to late 1800s. So you get this interesting landscape of it's woodland. It's all feels very close. And then it opens out into these massive lakes and over these rolling mountains. It's just the location combined with the cinematography, the skill of filmmaking, and that score. It's just a really great film.
So, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on. I mean, I, for one, have learned so much about 1700 weaponry. I think we could have done two. We could have done an episode on the film and an episode on the weapons on the film quite easily. It's just been fantastic having you on. You can find Jonathan he's on GameSpot's YouTube channel. Really great weapons, detailed weapons videos on the Royal Armouries channel. And we're just really glad to have him today.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I knew it'd be a good one. I knew it was going to be good because A, I love the film, and B, I know you love the film. And I knew that you'd have some brilliant things to say, and we definitely went on some tangents that I think everyone's going to really enjoy.
We did. We didn't even get into what pattern of brown vest they were using.
Quickly, what was it?
Well, it should be pattern 1742, but it appears to be 1756.
There you go. Well, there you
Which
go.
is entirely too new and wouldn't have reached them.
No, exactly.
Correct. But the differences are incredibly minor.
We'll have to get Jonathan back for another one because it's been great. So as always, like, share, subscribe, wherever you're listening on. drop us a review if you'd be so kind. You can also support the podcast on Patreon, and you can find the link on our website, fightingonfilm.com. And this is the gang signing off again, and we'll catch you again in the next one. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.